Welcome back to Fire or Not to Fire. It's Shakespearean. President Trump addressing reports today that he may be planning to axe Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell and that he had a draft letter ready for his removal. Those reports sent the Dow and NASDAQ on a roller coaster ride. Markets did stabilize as President Trump poured cold water on these plans.
Have you drafted a letter?
I haven't drafted a letter.
So you didn't show a letter to Republican lawmakers last night?
No, I talked about the concept of fire, and I said, what do you think? Almost every one of them said I should. But I'm more conservative than they are.
The president also talking about the future of the Fed.
He's always been too late, hence his nickname, Too Late. He should have cut interest rates a long time ago. He's doing a lousy job, but no, I'm not talking about that. Fortunately, we get to make a change in the next, 8 months or so, and we'll pick somebody that's good. It's not a tough job, to be honest. Assuming you're smart, it's not a tough job. If you're a dummy, then I guess it's a tough job. But it might be one of the easiest jobs I've ever seen.
So, why would the president want to fire Powell? What's holding him back from firing Powell? And what would it mean for everyday Americans? Joining me now to answer those questions is Scott Martin from Kingsview Asset Management. Scott, it's great to have you on the program today. Let's talk about why the president would want to fire Jerome Powell. I looked this up today. It looks like the chairman of all of the big banks of Europe have cut interest rates and are not as much concerned about inflation, seemingly, as Jerome Powell. So President Trump wants to see interest rates lowered like Europe.
He does, and things in Europe, as we know well, are strikingly different typically than they are in the United States and even countries abroad besides Europe. So they tend to have different central bank expressions, some of which are not well advised. Here's the weird thing, though. If President Trump thinks about interest rate cuts and what they really do, they don't automatically affect open market rates. And that's one of the problems, is that the Fed funds rate is an overnight bank lending rate. It does not affect necessarily point to point, say, the 10-year Treasury rate or your mortgage rates or your credit card rates. Here's the other funny thing, Will. If the president does some history, as he does, some history lesson work, he's going to remember last year the Fed came in and cut rates by about 100 basis points ahead of the election or around the election. And what happened, my friend? Rates went up in the open market because it was the wrong move to make. I think Powell's actually got this one right. I think the rhetoric from President Trump is probably a little bit too harsh, and he should just stay to the sidelines as far as Powell goes. That's when the market and rates seem to do the best.
Well, President does disagree with you, Scott, so...
Sadly.
Yeah, I would love to host that debate between you and President Trump on whether or not Jerome Powell's getting this right. My suspicion is, by the way, that the rate cuts are coming, that Jerome Powell does have these scheduled out over the fall. That's just my suspicion. But the president, therefore, is calling him too late. That's his point. It's too late. Not that something catastrophic is coming, but that you could juice the economy without much threat to inflation in the short term. But that brings me to my second question. What's holding the president back? I mean, that would be unprecedented, right, Scott? The president doesn't theoretically have the power to fire the Fed. It is supposed to be politically independent.
Correct. And it doesn't seem like the rhetoric would suggest of today that it is that independent. And maybe Powell is proving that it is because he's not succumbing to what President Trump is suggesting. Now, look, I think he doesn't want to fire Powell because he's probably still working through the idea of who he's going to nominate. And maybe there's other folks, Will, that are out there that are saying, hey, I'll take the job, but I'm not lowering rates either. I mean, maybe a guy like Dave Portnoy would come in and lower rates because he seems to do anything weird that happens out there with regards to investment advice and whatnot. And we know that from before. But the reality is, look, it could be anybody's job. And he's not necessarily a dummy, by the way. Powell isn't. He's not that late. I think the Fed has to be pragmatic as they are right now. And if you notice, the market has been okay. The problem with the market this year in the S&P, as we're investors too, is the tariff talk. The tariff talk has been the big pressuring point on the S&P, not the Federal Reserve.
Scott, I think everybody would appreciate interest rates coming down, whether or not it is on their mortgage or whether or not it's in other aspects of the open market. I've heard you make your point today. You don't think they're directly connected, but there is a strong correlation between the Fed rate and open market rates. And I think everybody would like to see lower rates on the open market and what that would do for the economy. By the way, I don't know what to make of the shot at Dave Portnoy and him being the Federal Reserve.
Was that a shot at him? I was trying to defer. I mean, that was a deference point. But one, too, that Dave Portnoy knows well that in a normal market environment, that's correct. But right now, this is not exactly the most normal economy. So that's why, too, we saw last year rates went down as far as the Fed funds rate and rates in the open market went up. That was not helpful.
All right. I think that it has the tariff policies, as much as you suggest it is what is causing uncertainty in the markets, the uncertainty always seems to be erring on the side of positivity right now. Proclamations of dystopia and economic collapse and rising inflation, and every economic report that comes back undercuts that to the positive side for President Trump and, by the way, for the people of America. So I think there is a reasonable expectation at some point for the interest rates to reflect our economic reality. Maybe Powell has the timing right, but we're all going to get there. It's going to head that way. It's a matter of when. Even if Dave Portnoy is the Fed chief, and I don't think he will be.
Hey, we may need him at this point. Who knows?
All right. Thanks, Scott.
See you, Will.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.